Good morning, everyone. Good morning. We're going to go ahead and get started. On behalf of the NNVAWI Conference Planning Committee, I would like to officially welcome you all to the 24th NNVAWI Conference. Woo! All I can say is we made it. Some of us are here in person. Some of us are joining us virtually for the first time in NNVAWI history. And I will say, when a small group of members from North Carolina came together in January 2020 and said, hey, why don't we host the next NNVAWI conference? Little did we know what the next 2.5 years we're going to have in store for all of us, right? And so I think really what we relied on a lot was flexibility, resiliency, and support from our community. And so as we moved through in developing the conference program, that really became critical for our theme. And so the theme for this year's conference is promoting resiliency and equity to address gender-based violence through community-led solutions and partnerships. And the quality of abstracts that we received for this year's conference was truly amazing. And we're so excited to learn about the cutting-edge work of our presenters in the areas of equity, resiliency, community partnerships, and innovative solutions to address and prevent violence over the next 3 days of this conference. And so to go ahead and kick us off, I'd like to invite Liz Tomlinson, assistant professor at North Carolina Central University and lifelong resident of North Carolina, to lead us in a land acknowledgement.
Thank you. We're hosting this conference from the lands today known as North Carolina in the United States, and we acknowledge the traditional custodians of the area, who include the Kahone, Eastern Band of the Cherokee Indians, Halewa Sapone, Lumbee, Meherrin, Occaneechi Band of the Saponi, and Waccamaw Siouan people. We acknowledge the grave and continued harms of colonialism to these lands, in particular the erasure of both indigenous and African identities, not only under slavery, but also via racist laws that segregated people into binary and arbitrary classifications. The Americans among our group acknowledge that we work and live in cities and economies built upon the knowledge and labor stolen from enslaved Africans. Finally, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you all live and work today, and pay respects to elders past, present, and emerging. We celebrate the diversity of Indigenous and Aboriginal people and their ongoing culture and connections to the lands and waters upon which we all rely.
So as we all know, the global COVID-19 pandemic has transformed how we're able to meet, connect, and share ideas with one another. This conference is the first time that NNVAWI is hosting an in-person event alongside a virtual one, where attendees can participate remotely. And so I'm going to admit it wasn't the easiest thing in the world to plan a hybrid conference, but I think we are really excited about the opportunity that it's presented for increasing accessibility to those who would not have been able to attend otherwise. So this year, we have 160 attendees representing 17 countries across 5 continents. And that's the largest and most diverse group of attendees at any NNVAWI conference. So we're very much looking forward to the events and presentations that will be shared over the next 3 days. This includes 123 podium presentations, 9 project pitches, and 8 symposiums. And so many of these are going to be presented in person during the conference, while others are going to be available on demand through our conference website. So just to highlight some of the major presentation themes, The first is we have numerous presentations focused on COVID-19, recognizing the significant impact that the pandemic has had on violence. We also have numerous presentations focused on healthcare system responses to addressing violence, highlighting innovative strategies that we can use as nurses, midwives, social workers, and other members of the healthcare team to address violence in clinical settings. And then finally, throughout the conference, we will hear about diverse perspectives and populations, many of whom are disproportionately impacted by violence. We are also very excited to welcome our 4 keynote speakers who will be presenting throughout the 3 days. These include Sherry Hamby, Research Professor of Psychology, University of the South, Director of LifePath's Research Center, and founder and co-chair of ResilienceCon. Monica Day, founder and executive director of Stand Up Speak Out of North Carolina. Claudia Garcia Moreno, Sexual Violence Research Initiative founder and lead on violence against women for the World Health Organization, and Karen Sheffield Abdullah, assistant professor at the School of Nursing, University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. So, more information about our keynote speakers, our presenters, our presentations can be found on our conference website. All of you should have received information about how to log into the website a few days ago. If you have any trouble with that, please either email us at conference@nnvawi.org or check in at the front desk, and we can help get those issues resolved for you. But we encourage you to explore all of the presentations that are available on the website. And there's also areas within there where you can post on social media, add comments, discussions. I think in order to add discussions, you just need to verify your email address in the system to be able to post, so don't forget to do that. And then that will help everybody engage with one another, whether we're in person or attending virtually. The other thing I'd like to mention about the website is we also have access. It will be open for the next 12 months after the conference. So if there are presentations that you don't have time to see, you'll be able to go back and view those at a later time. I am also proud to announce that all of our conference abstracts have been published in a special issue of the Journal of Advanced Nursing. And so I think so much credit needs to be given to Susan Jack, Liz Tomlinson, and Nick Matheny for all their work to make this happen. So our conference abstracts will be available as open access for the next 3 months to increase accessibility, so make sure you download your copy. There's a link here on the website, but also on our conference website, if you go under more information, you'll see a link to the special issue right there on our website. And then we encourage you to tweet and share information about the special issue on all those social media platforms. So just some housekeeping for everybody. We do have some resources that will be available to you all throughout the conference. So Junior Ballroom D3 has been set up and reserved as a lactation or wellness area. And so if anybody needs some space, to take care of themselves, for pumping or, just for a break, to be able to take off our masks in a private location, D3 is set aside for you to be able to do that. There is a sign on the door that says open or close, do not disturb. So if the door is shut and that sign is turned over, please respect privacy and wait until the door's reopened to go in there. We also, Junior Ballroom D1 has been set up as a virtual session viewing room, and so this is an area where you can go in with your laptops and headphones and then view some of the virtual recordings that are available on the website if you choose. Junior Ballroom A3 has been reserved for a preview of the Paradise AI-powered experience, which is led by Dr. Nancy Glass, and she will be providing some more information about how to sign up for this preview during lunch today. And then finally, everybody wants to know about Wi-Fi access, and so the table tents on all of the tables throughout provide the login information, to the password and the connection. So if any of you need to connect to Wi-Fi, that's where you can turn to. Just a reminder about our COVID-19 protocols. We have name badge stickers, so if you haven't gotten it, you can stop by the front desk, and so we have these labeled red, yellow, and green based on your social distancing comfort. And then we just want to remind everybody to wash hands and wear masks often throughout the conference so we can make sure we keep each other safe. This afternoon, we have a welcome reception starting at 4:30 right here in the ballroom. In your name badge, you all should have a drink ticket that will entitle you to one drink, and then there'll be additional drinks available for payment after. Tomorrow at 8:30, there is a student reflection breakfast in the Junior Ballroom A2. Those of you who were registered as students will have a ticket in your name badge to attend that as well. And then finally, I want to remind you that tomorrow, right after lunch, we will be having our project pitches in this room. There will be 2 awards that are given out for the best project pitches. In the conference program, under the project pitch area, there's a link where you can submit your evaluations for the project pitches. And so we encourage you all to locate that and have that ready so you can vote and help us evaluate the project pitches for the awards. Then I just want to give my warmest thank you and gratitude for the conference planning team. The local team consisted of myself, Dr. Rosa Gonzalez-Sguarda, Dr. Liz Tomlinson, and Dr. Linda Bullock. These are also people, if any of you are looking for restaurant recommendations or things like that, come find one of us. And then I would also like to thank our NNVA-WI board representatives who also served on the conference planning team as well. Michelle Monroe-Kramer, Lisa Hooker, Donna Schmenke, Renee Filette, Karen Campbell, Larissa Jennings-Maya Wilson, and Nick Matheny. And last but not least, I need to thank from the bottom of our hearts, our conference sponsors. I think planning a conference in the middle of a pandemic is no small feat, and this would not have been possible without the generous support from our community. And now I would like to invite Dr. Lisa Hooker to come up and give a few words as the president of NNVA-WI.
Hello, everyone, and welcome, and everyone that's streaming in online. It's so great to be here. My name is Lisa Hooker, and I'm the president of the Nursing Network on Violence Against Women International. And on behalf of the board of directors, I'd like to congratulate Dr. Jessica Williams and the conference planning committee on what looks like a fantastic program of events. So please put your hands together. I think a few years back we actually surveyed the members to see what was most important to them about the network, and the conference, of course, was the one thing that really people wanted to maintain and were really excited about. And so I encourage you all to catch up with your colleagues, enjoy the conference, make some new friends. Please reach out and say hello to me and have a wonderful time. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. And now I am pleased to introduce our opening keynote speaker, Dr. Sherry Hamby, who will be presenting her talk, Trauma is Everywhere, but So is Resilience. Dr. Hamby is Research Professor of Psychology at the University of the South and Director of the Life Paths Research Center. She is an internationally recognized authority on victimization and trauma and is best known for her work in polyvictimization, resilience, and violence measurement. A licensed clinical psychologist, Dr. Hamby has worked for more than 25 years on the problem of violence, including frontline crisis intervention and treatment, involvement in grassroots organizations, and research leading to the publication of more than 200 articles and books. Her most recent book with Victoria Banyard is Strengths-Based Prevention, Reducing Violence and Other Public Health Problems, published last November. She is founder and co-chair of ResilienceCon, an annual international conference that offers opportunities to interact with colleagues who are interested in strength-based approaches to understanding, preventing, and responding to violence and other adversities. And you can find more information about the current call for submissions for next year's ResilienceCon in your conference bags. An influential researcher, Dr. Hamby has been ranked in the top 1% among more than 6 million researchers in 22 disciplines based on citations of her work. Her awards include outstanding contributions to the science of trauma psychology from the American Psychological Association. Dr. Hamby's work has appeared in the New York Times, Huffington Post, CBS News, Psychology Today, and hundreds of other media outlets. We're so fortunate to have her here with us today. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Sherry.
Good morning. Morning, there you go. Thank you for that very kind introduction and for inviting me here today. Today I want to talk to you about pathways to overcoming violence and trauma. But before I start, I'd actually like to just take a brief moment and encourage everybody to take a couple of deep breaths. I was talking with someone, with Melissa earlier this morning about returning to these in-person spaces and really how wonderful it is to do that. And so I just hope we can all take a moment to appreciate that we've all been able to gather, whether it's online or in person, and to bring some intentionality to being here in this moment today. I want to hopefully start with some experiences that are familiar to many of you, and then shift in a way that I've shifted in my own work in the last 10 years or so. And then my ultimate goal for the day is to try to shift as many of you in that direction to strengths-based approaches too. So sometimes, as probably has happened to most of you many times, someone might disclose their violence against women or other traumas to you. They might tell you what they've done to cope. And in the resilience literature, a common metaphor for coping is an umbrella. So in our metaphor, they might show you their umbrella. And a lot of the responses that we have can be summed up as, you need a bigger umbrella. So this could involve, in a nursing setting, getting additional providers on someone's treatment team. It might getting people to disclose more, for example, by asking them to call the National Domestic Violence Hotline. A lot of our therapy interventions also fit this idea, such as cognitive behavioral therapy frameworks, things like positive self-talk, or basically getting like a bigger or umbrella. Or in a psychodynamic framework, this would involve encouraging people to spend more time analyzing early childhood experiences. And sometimes, in the kind of resilience approaches that I hope by the end of my talk you're going to come to see as problematic and hopefully things to avoid, these interventions boil down to little more than just saying you need to get more grit or you need to get more determination. Other people will pull out a different umbrella, And in this case, you might say, well, what you need is a completely, as a different umbrella from this. You don't want one full of these holes. And so in our analogy, this could include things like using substance abuse to self-medicate, where you want them to switch out that maladaptive coping strategy for a healthier one. In the CBT framework, probably the most classic example would be trying to get people to shift off of black and white thinking or catastrophizing or these kinds of cognitive biases and substitute more rational approaches to problems. In the psychodynamic framework, actually more similarly than they might like to admit, they're probably trying to get you to focus on shifting off of what they call primitive defense mechanisms like projection and denial and substitute things like sublimation for that. In the DV world, basically some of the options that that function as getting a different umbrella would include things like shelters, dangerousness assessment, safety plans, where the underlying goal of most of those is to get people to sever their relationship with the perpetrator or make some other dramatic change in their life. And if people follow all of these advice and take all of these steps, then they might end up with a really nice umbrella. But the thing about umbrellas is that, they're only good, they're not that great, right? I mean, there aren't that many people who are really into umbrellas. In this language of psychology, we're talking about things that really translate into buffering strategies. They're resources that only help people for specific problems, but are generally not that much good for anything else. And so umbrellas fit this really quite nicely because the only thing they do is that they help you stay dry when it rains. But as everybody knows about umbrellas, they're actually not really that good for that, are they? The thing is that they're not really good if it's windy outside. They're no good for a really heavy rain. They're a pain to carry around if it's just a drizzle, or even any time, which is actually why I don't even have full-size umbrellas with me today, right? Because they're just a hassle to carry around. And so even when it's raining exactly the right amount in exactly the right way for an umbrella to be helpful, I personally, and most people I know, still often make the choice to just skip the umbrella, walk a little faster, and get a little wet. And so I think similarly, most of our conventional approaches to violence against women are like this, that they really require a fairly big investment for a fairly small payoff. I realize that for those of you who are nurses, you have a lot of very snazzy umbrellas. You have antibiotics, chemotherapy, surgery. I mean, you can basically make the rain stop, with some of the medical interventions that we've got. And with the medical model as inspiration, it's not surprising that we've invested a lot of energy in trying to come up with umbrellas for the psychological and long-term physiological effects of violence and trauma. Now I'm talking about outcomes like PTSD, depression, and the long-term health consequences of traumatic stress. But the truth is, once you're in these kinds of domains of outcomes, there are not that many umbrellas. We've wasted a lot of resources on trying to create specialized interventions that have little, if any, evidence in support of their outcomes. This includes mainstream interventions for violence against women, like shelters, support groups, and orders of protection. Even interventions like cognitive behavioral therapy show modest effects at best under ideal circumstances. So let's put these umbrellas away and think about what other tools might be out there. It turns out that for helping people overcome violence and trauma, there are a lot of Swiss Army knives. Don't worry, this is just a toy Swiss Army knife. I didn't bring a blade to a violence conference. But Swiss Army knives, as I'm sure everybody here knows, they're good for all kinds of things and all kinds of needs. And most of the factors that help us overcome trauma are like Swiss Army knives. Resources like social support are good things to have, whether we're in a violent relationship or we've experienced trauma or not. So is a sense of purpose or emotion regulation. pretty much any strength in our social ecology. We err when we invest more in umbrellas than Swiss Army knives for violence and trauma. Although many classic interventions were creative responses to the socio-political environment in which they engaged, they are not particularly likely pathways to safety. For example, CDC data has shown that more than 94% of women who eventually do leave violent relationships do so without ever accessing a shelter. And even for those who do access shelters, there's little evidence that their outcomes are better than those who don't. Shelters are costly and difficult to maintain, and they even raise complex issues that we don't often talk about staff pay and working conditions. Instead, we need a different approach. And the approach I want to recommend to you today is based on my and my colleagues' resilience portfolio model, and it offers a different prescription for overcoming trauma. This approach starts with a phenomenon that's probably very familiar to all of you, the dose-response effect. And it's based on analysis of the 3 elements that are required for understanding resilience. The first of these elements is trauma. Resilience only happens if there is something to overcome, whether it is violence, the trauma that I've studied most, or some other kind of adversity. In psychology, we use a broad definition of trauma, which I've put up on the slide here, one that I particularly like: events leading to threat or actual harm and injury, humiliating and shaming, or witnessing harm to others. In terms of psychological and long-term physiological outcomes, it's important to recognize that there does not have to be a visible physical injury in order for an event to be traumatic. Around the turn of the century, through work on adverse childhood experiences by Vince Felitti and colleagues, and work on polyvictimization by David Finkelhor, Heather Turner, and myself, and the efforts of many others, researchers came to realize that the most important aspect of trauma is your cumulative lifetime trauma dosage. Lifetime trauma dosage, most often measured as the number of different types of trauma someone is exposed to, is strongly associated with many biopsychosocial outcomes, which is the second element that you have to understand resilience. You must know how someone is functioning now in order to determine whether they are resilient. The work on trauma dosage, which has now been confirmed in hundreds, if not thousands of studies, it's an extremely easy phenomenon to capture in research, shows that adversity has negative impacts on more than 40 biopsychosocial outcomes, including the main causes of mortality and morbidity. These include not only, as you might have guessed, conditions like PTSD and depression and suicidality, but they also include, perhaps more surprisingly, many conditions like heart disease, cancer, chronic bronchitis, and emphysema. You can see the effects of violence and trauma on our bodies decades after it occurs. And notably, the strengths of these dose-response effects are higher for many of the better-known risk factors that we talk about a lot in healthcare, such as diet and exercise. But what is lifetime trauma dosage? To demonstrate the lifetime dosage of trauma, I've brought a scale that I hope is going to stay put up there on the corner. Now we know, to fully capture the true burden of trauma, we have to assess, yes, of course, as what we're here to talk about today, violence against women, such as sexual assault, domestic violence, and other types of gendered violence. Like the original ACEs studies, we have to measure child abuse and other family-based adversities, like growing up with a parent with a severe mental illness. We have to measure the peer and community traumas that were first captured in the research on polyvictimization. We also have to capture things like workplace harassment, police brutality, and other forms of institutional betrayal, witnessing, seeing the aftermath, and being indirectly exposed to trauma, including things like children exposed to domestic violence, Societal forms of oppression and victimization like racism, homophobia, transphobia, sexism, ableism, and Islamophobia, historical trauma, and, of course, the pandemic, which among its many mind-boggling burdens has had especially notable impacts on healthcare providers. Most people's trauma histories look like this: a big pile of problems occurring over a lifetime that are a drag on our functioning. I grew up in a home with depressed and alcoholic parents, and my trauma dosage is not zero. I assume that virtually everyone in this room has a trauma history, and our reluctance to share those histories in professional spaces is part of what is holding us back from being more effective at helping others overcome trauma. Once we started taking a more comprehensive approach to trauma, it was easy to see that trauma is everywhere. Here's an example from one of my studies, showing that more than 8 in 10 people had experienced at least one type of victimization, and more than 98% had been exposed to some kind of trauma, including the loss of a loved one. This level of exposure is not unique to the United States. It's seen across the globe. While of course you're probably better off living in Sweden than you are in North Korea, even the wealthiest countries with the most extensive social safety nets have not found a way to eliminate trauma or even come close to eliminating trauma. It is truly pervasive across the globe. In your work, you might be used to focusing only on violence against women or some other specific kind of trauma. But to truly understand the person in front of you, you can't just know the reason for referral or the most recent incident that brought them to healthcare. This shift from studying single types of violence to focusing on lifespan trauma dosage has led to many important insights about the mechanisms of how trauma affects our bodies. Just like this pile of weights, our traumatic experiences weigh us down, and the size of each of our piles matters. Dosage matters because a lot of the impact of traumatic events is physiological. As the psychiatrist Bessel van der Kolk says, the body keeps the score. Each dose of trauma adds to the wear and tear on our bodies, as can be seen in allostatic load, which is commonly assessed by biomarkers of chronic stress, such as cortisol reactivity or inflammation. As you might surmise, knowing that there are so many health effects of trauma, trauma affects all the systems in our body, perhaps most notably the neuroendocrine, immune, metabolic, and stress response systems. As far as we know, with the current state of science, there are not different physiological responses to different types of trauma, which is why dosage matters more than any particular type. Whether you are raped, bullied, or abused by a parent, the physiological effects are similar. Further, these physiological effects often interact with psychosocial impacts to create the vicious cycles that all of us are so intimately familiar with from our work with clients and perhaps even from our own struggles. For example, increased allostatic load can lead to depression. Depression can lead to self-medication with substances. That aggravates inflammation, which can further worsen your depressive symptoms. And then all the while this is happening while people are also harming their interpersonal networks that are needed for recovery and thriving. So I've been told many times, in fact, that is really a bummer story, that that's a grim, yeah, some people are nodding. They're like, yes, that's really, like we thought we were just dealing with, violence against women, and now you're like throwing all these other kinds of stuff in. But it's okay, because I've got some other blocks with me here too. And now we're going to turn to how we can counterbalance all of that trauma. Humans are really amazing, and we can thrive despite even very high burdens of trauma. In fact, some of the most accomplished people who have ever lived are also people who have incredibly high dosages of trauma. And so today, the concept of dosage is also revolutionizing our understanding of resilience. One of the big limitations of early resilience research paralleled the problem of early violence research. Those studies, too, often tended to focus on a single incident, like a rape or a natural disaster, and assume that there had been no dose of trauma before that and that there's not going to be any dose of trauma after that. We now know that that is wrong for most people. But probably the biggest problem with early resilience research, and even some that goes on today, is that it promotes the idea that resilience is a personality trait, when really it is a process that involves the whole social ecology. In the personality approach, resilience is often loosely equivalent to grit or emotional toughness, but not all problems call for emotional toughness. I know this well because as a child of alcoholics, emotional toughness is my comfort zone. I was adultified at a fairly young age, and I am really good at acting like I can handle anything at any time. Sometimes that has served me well, and it does contribute to my resilience. But sometimes what I need to do is reveal my vulnerability. And it's taken years of practice for me to even be able to say that in front of a room full of people, because I kind of hate that word even today. I'll probably go to my grave sort of hating that word. But I have practiced it for a long time, and now I am better at asking for help when I need it or recognizing when I need help. And now being able to express my vulnerability is part of my resilience portfolio. That's a good example, I think, of how the personality approach wrongly assumes that there's a one-size-fits-all approach to dealing with any kind of trauma. But that's not the only thing wrong with the personality approach to resilience. The personality approach is also unfair to everyone in this room and to anyone who has ever helped anyone overcome trauma, because it ignores the social ecology and the role that other people, families, communities, cultures have in helping people overcome. It also, I think, is one of the many reasons that we tend to fall into victim blaming, even in many of our services that are supposed to help trauma victims, because it assumes that if you're not overcoming your trauma, that there's something wrong with you as an individual, instead of being more sensitive about taking into account varying degrees of trauma dosage, different sizes of people's piles, and the need that they might have to expand their resilience portfolio in other directions by bringing in other people to help them overcome. Perhaps especially importantly for those of us who are not just trying to overcome our own trauma, but are trying to craft systems and provide services that help others, the personality approach can also dissuade needed investment in social welfare programs. And finally, it really offers no guidance at all for those of us who are trying to unpack that black box between trauma and outcomes. We know some people manage to have good outcomes despite their trauma. You can't just say, be more resilient. That's not a treatment plan. And so the personality approach does not help us guide where our prevention and intervention resources should be focused. So if that's the wrong way to think about resilience, then what's the right way? The resilience portfolio model brings the concept of dosage to resilience too. We use a concept called polystrengths, it's kind of akin to polyvictimization, to represent strengths dosage, the number of assets and resources people have in their resilience portfolios. The psychosocial strengths are the third piece we need to understand resilience. The mechanisms that, like a Swiss Army knife, provide the tools to help us get to positive outcomes despite our trauma dosage. We further break down this category into 3 domains. The first is meaning-making strengths. These involve connecting to something larger than yourself. This includes sense of purpose, which is really probably the most important of all of the strengths in a resilience portfolio. It includes things like identifying with a mission, such as reducing the burden of trauma, which is my mission and probably the mission of many of you in this room, a role such as a parent or teacher, and a creed such as those involved in religious faith or military oaths. Another domain are regulatory strengths, which are the ways we manage behavioral and emotional impulses. This includes emotion regulation, which classically has tended to focus on managing negative emotions like anger and distress. But what we found in our work also needs to include the ability to regulate positive emotions. So being able to cheer yourself up and manage to move from, neutral or bad actually into a good mood or a positive sense of well-being. It also includes strengths like psychological endurance. And then finally, there's also the interpersonal strengths. These are the rest of the social ecology. It represents all the resources we can access from our family, our friends, or other loved ones, from our communities, our societies, and cultures. Includes social support, connectedness, and institutional resources like healthcare. Many, many studies have shown what you can see here in this scale, that good stuff counts more than bad stuff. Further, what helps the most are the kinds of strengths that help in lots of situations. Things like social support and emotion regulation are good whether or not you've experienced trauma. So they're not a buffering or a moderator or an interaction effect or whatever kind of term you want to use for it. It's an additive model. You want to thrive, the prescription is bringing more good stuff to your life. I'd love to tell you more about all the basic research we've been doing on identifying the key strengths in a resilience portfolio, but because our time is limited today, I'm actually going to shift gears a little bit now and turn instead to evidence-based pathways to get more of these good things in your lives, your client lives, and your institutions. We could talk about this for a long time too, because there's a ton of exciting work being done in these areas, but this morning I just want to highlight some of the most promising approaches and talk about how you can implement them in a wide range of settings. The first one I want to mention is mindfulness. Once dismissed in the US as a fringe or alternative practice, this 2,500-year-old tradition has stood the test of time. What's more, once science finally started taking it seriously in the last 20 or 30 years, it stood the test of numerous randomized controlled trials too, and several recent meta-analyses or statistical reviews of the literature have shown that mindfulness-based therapies are most effective. One of the things I like best about mindfulness is that you don't have to be good at it to benefit from it. I like to say that if a practice is it's easy to screw up, then it's going to be hard to scale up. I'm not particularly good at mindfulness. My mind wanders, I get fidgety, but I still benefit from the practice. Another fantastic thing about mindfulness is that it works across the lifespan. There's lots of evidence with using it with people as young as toddlers, and you can use it all the way up to the end of life. For a terrific free introduction for either yourself or your clients, I really recommend Mindfulness Daily, which is a free 40-day online program, and there's also some resources for kids on the slides. One of the challenges I've become aware of as I give these talks in lots of different places is helping people figure out how they can take whatever someone is talking about it and translate that into their practice. And so I've tried to spend some time thinking about what that might look like for these various interventions. And so mindfulness, another wonderful thing about mindfulness is that it's really easy to integrate this into a lot of different workspaces. You could begin or end a therapy session with a brief 5-minute meditation. You can create a labyrinth on the grounds of your facilities for people to access. You can incorporate mindfulness meditation into the daily routine of domestic violence shelters or other services. Some years ago, actually here in North Carolina, I used to serve on the board of a domestic violence shelter. And, during the course of the day, I'm sorry to say that there just wasn't that much going on. There was the occasional support group, but it really probably the thing we could have done that would have helped those women more than anything else would be to start things like mindfulness groups or yoga groups and to make that part of the services that were being offered. And, if you're in a setting where you have to have a more formalized therapy approach, then in this large meta-analysis that I mentioned on the previous slide by Van Achteren and all, they looked at more than 1,400 randomized controlled trials, and all of the therapies that had the bigger elements of mindfulness in them really performed statistically better than straight cognitive behavioral or other kinds of services. So things like acceptance and commitment therapy, mindfulness-based stress reduction, or dialectical behavior therapy. So if you do have to, for whatever reason, offer something that's more formalized, then I recommend considering shifting to something like that. It's also important to think about how we can incorporate these tools into our own work and living spaces. So you can incorporate them into things like staff meetings or daily shift schedules. Try to get mindfulness retreats to count for professional development. We have an online mindful writing group that we would be happy for you to join. Those are just a handful of examples. Another great tool to have in your resilience portfolio is exercise. Of course, exercise has many physical benefits, but we now know that exercise helps with depression and anxiety about as much as, or even more than, psychotropic medications. As you may know, it's now the first line of treatment in many places like Canada and Scotland, where the healthcare systems have not been as fully co-opted by capitalism. Some of you might be thinking about some of these things, like, I've told my patients to exercise and they don't do it. I'm guessing you might be thinking that because that's the response that I get from a lot of people. But I'm going to suggest that that's the wrong way to think about it. We already know that just telling people the right way to behave, whether it's to improve their diet or exercise or make whatever changes, does not have any impact on people's behavior and can even have a boomerang effect and make things worse. Vicki Banyard and I just recently came out with a book called Strengths-Based Prevention that really, as one of its main points, is that we need to move away from these admonishment-based intervention programs because we've got 40 years of strong data showing that they don't change anybody's behavior. Instead, the idea is to focus on how you could incorporate exercise into the times and spaces where you interact with your clients. As we will discuss more in a few minutes, this is the beginning of learning to think systemically and shift off those problematic individual-focused approaches we were discussing earlier. So you can start with assessment and include an evaluation of regular physical activity into intakes. This might happen in some nursing settings, but it's probably not very likely to happen in a lot of other settings like domestic violence shelters or rape crisis centers. You can, again, create paths on the grounds of your facilities or incorporate exercise into the routine of your shelters or other programs. There are many other possibilities we might discuss, such as art or music therapy, for example, but for now I want to transition to thinking even more systemically, and so the next set of approaches I want to mention are ones that help better incorporate nature into our lives. We're involved in the natural world, but many of us are starved for contact with nature. There's a huge scientific base showing that contact with the natural environment improves our mental health and boosts our immune systems, also showing promise for interrupting vicious cycles. This includes evidence that simply being outdoors, an invention that's called Shinrin-yoku in Japan, which loosely translates to forest bathing, is better than spending time in more urban environments. They've been doing this since the 80s. They have tons of randomized controlled trials on this topic. There's evidence that exercising in natural environments is better for you than the same amount of exercise in an indoor or urban setting, and that simply adding green spaces, like the one on the slide here, in the forms of parks or community gardens can increase the well-being of an entire community. I want to mention that there's exciting work that's being done on the mechanisms for this too, and that there's really intriguing research being done on things like phytoncides, which are volatile organic compounds that plants produce, or soil-based bacteria such as Mycobacterium. Once again, the way to promote this is not just say, have you thought about taking up gardening, but to think systemically about ways that it can be integrated into your professional workspaces. It can be as simple as bringing green plants into your office. Even an outdoor bench, in addition to the trails I mentioned earlier, can be helpful. You can provide information to your clients about gardening or houseplants, or even consider offering seeds or small plants. Some of them are really hard to kill and will, raise people's sense of well-being and perhaps even help with their immune systems. You can invest in landscaping around your workspace or considering adding gardening programs to any treatment centers that you're a part of. And many facilities are also working on building gazebos or other accessible spaces so that it makes it easier for you to bring more of your programming outdoors. So now I'd like to pivot to even more towards thinking systemically. Although we're often taught to blame ourselves or our clients for our and their limitations, many times the challenges lie more in our environment. Learning to think systemically means learning to think about how environmental changes can help many people all at one time, instead of focusing on teaching people one by one to cope with adverse environments. Conventional wisdom in our field often ignores bigger picture systemic thinking. Like the way that, even 50 years after the domestic violence movement got started, we still look to victims to leave their homes and everything behind instead of asking perpetrators to do that. Or the way that so many sexual assault prevention programs still focus on trying to teach women how not to become victims instead of trying to teach men how to refrain from sexual violence. Frankly, it's a hard mental switch to make because in the US and so many similar cultures, there's such an ingrained focus on individuals. And so I've found that a good baby step into thinking more systemically is to start with assessment. There are several systemic tools that are really great, especially if you want to shift from helping people overcome violence to helping them avoid it. A couple of examples that I'll mention today include hotspot mapping and geographic interviewing. The idea behind both approaches is that violence and trauma is not evenly distributed across any setting. For example, on most college campuses, there's a lot of violence against women, but most of it is not happening in the classrooms, it's happening in the dorms and at parties. In geographic interviewing, as you can see in this image, the focus can be even broader and gather information on where people have the strongest sense of belonging, the greatest social insecurities, etc. This can be especially valuable for spaces that are supposed to be therapeutic or educational, because if there's places where people are feeling anxious and afraid, then they're probably not really focusing on whatever programming you're offering. Once you've identified these problem areas, you can focus on changes such as the traffic flow, the schedule of when people access spaces, the number of staff or leaders in spaces, or things like that to try to reconstitute what these spaces feel like for people to be in them. A related approach is called the walk audit. In this type of assessment, you actually physically go out into these spaces and experience what it's like to move through them, noting areas where access is difficult, dangerous, or unwelcoming. In a walk audit, it can be useful to take videos or photographs to identify problematic or hard to access areas. So I'll give you the example of the Student Wellness Center on my own university campus. When I first came to that campus, the Student Wellness Center was not on the main campus, it was on the medical campus, which was about half a mile or so down the road. So if you had to get help for therapy or sexual assault intervention or anything like that, you either had to drive off to this space that has limited parking, or you had to walk down there and where the sidewalk ended at the end of main campus, and you'd have to walk along the road to get to it. And then there weren't really other reasons why students would be in those spaces, so it could be a very visible and stigmatizing thing to visit that space. Now what they've done is they have moved the Student Wellness Center, so now it is on Central Campus. There's also a gym in there, and they have all kinds of exercise groups and other groups, and so there's a lot of traffic coming in and out all the time for a variety of reasons, and it's a lot easier for people to access the services that they need. Now, I realize that, that obviously required a fairly big investment, and that might be something to start thinking about in terms of long-term planning for your institutions. But there's also a lot you can do with fewer resources. So if you want to think about how to think about incorporating this kind of systemic thinking about the built environment into your therapeutic or professional spaces, you can think about things like the arrangement of furniture in your spaces. Does your desk create a barrier between you and your clients, or is it arranged in such a way that you feel it feels less hierarchical and more collaborative? Can you think about the workflow? Or the signage? It's so often, my nephew was in a bad accident recently, and so I've been spending a lot of time in hospitals and that I'm not familiar with. And, it can really be amazing how unwelcoming that many of our professional spaces are. And if we're trying to promote well-being and thriving, how little attention we give to what messages those spaces are giving, not just to our clients, but also to ourselves. And so, things like signage, it could not just in terms of directions, but also in terms of, having affirmative statements of values on either, thinking about seating and how comfortable and welcoming is the seating, or even doing something as simple as like going to the elementary school and getting children's art that you can hang on the walls so that a place is more cheerful and friendly. These are the kinds of really limited changes you can make to the built environment that might have a big impact on what it's like to be in those environments for clients and their families. Before I turn to my final thoughts, I do want to mention that all that I've been talking about is based on more than 20 years of my own research, as well as on the work of many others. I've included key references on some of these slides. If you want to have a more in-depth reading about it, I would suggest the American Psychologist article that came out last year. And here are just a bunch more references by those things. But I want to end with two final thoughts. The first is a call to action. I know I've gone over a lot of material and that some of these would require big investments, but I hope that when you think about your own and your clients' resilience portfolios, that when you return from this conference, that you'll be able to pick one of these options and actually implement it in your setting. It could be as simple as bringing a plant to your office. Somebody asked me once if plastic was okay, and no, plastic is not okay, if that's what you decide to do. Or adding, some welcoming signage, or implementing, a daily mindfulness meditation ritual in your setting. And then finally, I'd like to leave you with a sense of hope. Whether you're thinking about your own trauma exposures or those of colleagues or clients, it is possible to overcome even very high dosages of trauma. We'd have to make our services more like the paths that we have followed. For me, getting an education, I was the first in my family to go to graduate school, and becoming an advocate against trauma and violence, which gave me a strong sense of purpose, not only helped me, in terms of those sort of concrete things, but it also brought me into these institutional and professional spaces where I was able to learn what the ingredients are to putting together a good life. By helping people build their resilience portfolios across all the layers of the social ecology, we can be far more effective at helping them thrive after trauma. For many years in the social science literature, we treated resilient people like unicorns, remarkable and rare. But it turns out that we're really like squirrels. We're everywhere. And we can help lots of other people find their inner squirrel too. Thank you very much. Yeah, absolutely. I think we have some time.
So I think we have a few minutes if there are any questions from the audience. I'm going to ask our IT, do we have handheld mics? Perfect. As your MC, I will run around with mics for anybody who has questions. Hello, hello. There we go. I'll go ahead and start and talk a little bit about my own research, which looks a little bit at like personal resources, and so things that I think we talk about a lot when somebody has experienced trauma and violence. So things like social support, self-efficacy, coping mechanisms, as kind of indicators of resilience. And some of the things I've found is that for some people, those differ. So not everybody needs social support. Sometimes they prefer self-efficacy versus social support. And so I wanted to just get your thoughts on that aspect and on what you've found about sort of the need to tailor. That exercise may not be the most appropriate for everybody, or not the most meaningful for them, if that makes sense. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about that.
Sure. Thank you for that question. That's a terrific question, and it's really, really one of the key elements of the resilience portfolio model. Nobody is good at everything. You don't have to be good at everything to thrive despite your trauma dosage, but we all do need a range of different kinds of tools in our toolkit. And so, right, some of it is not going to, not everybody is going to connect with mindfulness or exercise. As I said, if I had more time, I would have gone over some of the other, strengths-based approaches that have a lot of evidence behind them too. But I'm a huge fan, just to mention one, of narrative interventions of all types. I think that is also a really powerful and accessible one. And some people, right, they'll need more social support. Other people will need more emotion regulation. One of the next steps in the work that we're doing is working on creating an assessment so that you can do more customized treatment planning based on what particular people's needs are. So maybe you're working with somebody who already has a good social support network, but what their real struggles with are on regulatory strengths, or maybe it might be the other way around. You might have somebody who is relatively self-regulated, but they are really socially isolated, and so what they need is more help building up the interpersonal strengths on their resilience portfolio. So I think that unfortunately, so many of our tools are really one size fits all. Like, we give the same dangerousness assessment or safety plan, or or the same antidepressant medication or whatever for just people with like a whole range of situations. And so the idea behind resilience portfolios is to really recognize that people can put together different combinations. I've been working with a researcher in Kosovo, and one of the things that we're also trying to do that we feel the resilience portfolio model is really well suited for is adapting it to different sociocultural spaces. So they have different strengths there that are more important. So some of the ones so Kosovo just became a nation fairly recently, so they're going through this process that a lot of people there talked about as like nationwide meaning making and what it means to become like a citizen of Kosovo. And we really didn't get that kind of input when we were doing similar kinds of work with people in the United States. And they also really had a huge values that focused on family solidarity. So there's a whole lot of different strengths that could go in each of these domains, and they will definitely look different for different people. But I think the main thing is to really focus on a more strengths-based approach and not just things that keep focusing over and over again on getting them to rehash and revisit their violence and only experiences, and only offering them interventions that are specifically tooled with coping to violence, instead of more broadly trying to help them put together the pieces of a good life.
Do we have any other questions?
So my question is a little bit about, you mentioned about the positivity or positive self-talk, and moving that dial from not feeling, maybe from feeling bad or neutral to feeling good. And I'm just wondering if you could speak to how you introduce that so it doesn't become like toxic positivity.
Sure. That is something that emerged from the qualitative work that we've been doing in the communities, and and just a lot of people talking about, not so much in terms of interventions, but in their own healing journey about learning how to like self-soothe and cheer themselves up was like an important part of their own healing journey. I mean, I think that the key thing about, a lot of the resilience literature is kind of broken down into these different camps, and some people really think, self-regulation is everything about it, and, and I think that, or some others will just focus on social support, or some focus just on meaning making, and I mean, in some ways they're sort of all right, but I think that an over-reliance on any one of those elements in the portfolio is going to lead to things like toxic positivity, and especially I think that most of the time that in our work that we probably tend to overemphasize the regulatory strengths, and that is the kind of thing that can really lead to pressure to, do it all by yourself and to just have like this more grit or more determination model. But we really focus a lot on community resilience and, thinking about the built and the natural environments and how all of these things can support regulatory processes as well as other strengths.
Are there any other questions?
Thanks, Sherry. I'm just thinking about this idea of tailored interventions that Jessica was asking about, and about this idea of putting together a portfolio and, how that happens in the professional sphere. So, who puts the portfolio together? What's the role of the person in determining what their mix looks like? And I guess I'm reflecting a little bit on some of the most recent research that we've been doing that is showing how critical it is for the person, in this case the woman, to be determining what it is their priority at a particular point in time. And how does that fit into the mix of the way you understand the resilience portfolios that you're talking about?
Sure. I mean, I absolutely think that is an essential part of it. And, and again, I think that the status quo in a lot of places is to offer very one-size-fits-all set of options. And, if it's domestic violence, you can go to a shelter, or you could file for an order of protection, and you can join our support group. And then that's not very, then there's not much else that's being, offered in many settings. Sometimes I think that a lot of the people who come to these kinds of conferences are working at places that are more on the cutting edge, but I think in your garden variety domestic violence services in most communities that's what you're going to get. And so it's not very self-directed, and it's not very comprehensive or holistic in its approach too. So definitely I would suggest assessment, whether it's more that systemic stuff, or I also have my own safety plan tool called the Vigor, which includes asking people about their goals and assessing their strengths as well as their risk that they are facing. And I do think that in general, like starting with what people are looking for from their services is an important way to go. You can access the Vigor online if you just Google that, if you're interested in that. I suppose my most common experience that I have, even when I collect data in domestic violence shelters or other places where people are really heavily system involved, is that some of them have been involved in various systems for years, and we get told over and over again that this is the first time that anybody has asked them about the strengths in their lives or what they might have going for them. And so I totally agree with you that is a huge problem, and I think that this approach, like just making that shift to strengths-based approaches, is if you can make that mental adjustment, that it will really change the way that you see a lot of the services that your institutions are offering.
I think we have time for one more question, if there are any more. No? All right. Well, Sherry, I believe you will be here through tomorrow, correct?
I'll just be here
For the rest
till the rest of the day.
Okay,
Yeah.
perfect. So if anybody has any questions for Sherry, I'm sure you find her throughout the conference today. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So now the next part in our conference program is a break, and then we have our first series of breakout sessions starting at 10:45, and you can find the rooms either in the website conference program or in the At a Glance program in your conference bags. So we'll see everybody at their sessions at 10:45.
Down among the reeds and rushes, a baby boy was found. His eyes as clear as centuries, his silky hair was brown. Never been lonely, never been lied to, never had a scuffling fear, nothing denied to. Born at the instant, church bells chime. Traveling people, we like to go down a restaurant road, spend those euro dollars all the way from Washington to Tokyo. Well, I see them in the airport lounges upon their mother's breath. They follow me with open eyes. They're uninvited guests. Never been lonely, never been lied to, never had scuffling fear, nothing denied to. Born at the instant, church bells chime, the whole world whispering, born at the right time. There's too many people on the bus from the airport, too many holes in the crust of the earth. The planet groans every time it registers another bird. But down among the reeds and rushes, the baby girl was found. Her eyes as clear as centuries, her silky hair was brown. Never been lonely, never been lied to, never had something fear, nothing denied time. Give it to me 3 times, yeah. Give it to me 4 times. 456 was my number. Right now, someone has that number. One more time, baby. 456 was my number. Was my number. Right now, someone has that number. I say yeah. I say I'm on top of the world, I'm on top of the world, waiting on this for a while now, paying my dues to return. I've been waiting to smile, been holding it in for a while, take you with me if I can, been dreaming of this since a child. I'm on top of the world. I've tried to cut these corners, tried to take the easy way. I kept on falling short of something. I could've gave up then, but then again I couldn't have, 'cause I've traveled all this way for something. I take it in but don't look down. 'Cause I'm on top of the world, I'm on top of the world, been waiting on this for a while now, paying my dues to return. I've been waiting to smile, been holding it in for a while, take you with me if I can, been dreaming of this since a child. I'm on top of the world. 'Cause I'm on top of the world, I'm on top
So I'm just going to introduce the session and then.
Kicking things over.
That was pretty good. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Symposium 1A. Thank you all for being here. I'm really excited about the symposium. We have some excellent speakers, and the title of this symposium is The Role of Survivor-Led Design in Defining Recovery from Sexual Exploitation and Substance Use Disorder. I'll be moderating questions via both the live stream and for in-person attendees, and I'll let them take it away.
Good morning, everybody. So my name is Nikki Bell. I am the founder and chief executive officer of an organization based out of Worcester, Massachusetts called Living in Freedom Together, or call it LIFT. I myself am a person in recovery, which for me means I have not used drugs or alcohol in over 8 years, and also a survivor of many forms of gender-based violence, including prostitution and sex trafficking. When I exited the life 8 years ago, there were not any programs or resources that met the needs that I had that could treat my mental health, substance use, trauma, and the violence I experienced together. And so that is what Jonas Place does and is designed to do. So first, I'll just talk about what LIFT is an organization is and how it differs. Sorry. No, yes, that would be great if we could. There we go. So when we talk about survivor-led, oftentimes in the anti-trafficking movement or in other movements, we talk about involving peers. It's typically in a very performative way. And not really a meaningful way. So we hire people as peer specialists or advocates, but we actually don't consult them in the design of the program. They are not in executive leadership in our organizations. They are not on our boards. They are not. They are really at the very essentially direct service role of our organization. So LIFT differs in many ways. All of our programming and curriculum is created by and implemented by survivors. Over 70% of our staff are themselves people that have lived experience. We believe that survivors know best how to exit and recover from prostitution, and that if we are going to meaningfully develop programs, that they need to be at the helm in developing them. And so at LIFT, we literally, I am the founder and chief executive officer. I am a survivor. Our board has survivors in all of our leadership positions, all the way through our executive management down to our direct service roles. And we believe in creating pathways forward so people can start at a direct service role and build a career with us. Sorry. So the mission of LIFT is to end prostitution, and we believe we do that through legislation called the Equality Model. We also believe that survivors deserve access to high-quality exit programs. And so we are a survivor-led organization comprised of those who have exited prostitution and allies working collaboratively to provide high-quality exit services to end systems of prostitution through the Equality Model. Our vision is that we have a community where survivors are valued equal members of our community, and that their voices and choices are honored implicitly. So at LIFT, oftentimes we have these exit programs or recovery programs that really require people to be abstinent or meet some level of markers or engagement in order to access services and support. We believe that people are inherently valuable and worthy as they are. No matter where they are in their exiting process. And so we have services that kind of meet a continuum. We have our youth programming, which does not require people to be exited from the life or to not be experiencing violence to engage with us. We have Harbor, which is our maximum vulnerability low barrier shelter, which is for folks that are have active untreated substance use disorder, untreated mental health disorders, and are actively being exploited and prostituted. We they are super reactive and fun. But we continue to show up with unconditional positive regard, because just because people are not ready to exit does not mean they are not deserving of safety and access in our communities. So I'm just gonna step back very quickly. I wanted to say that, like, if people have questions throughout or comments, please feel free to kind of raise your hand. We'll save time at the end for questions as well, but if people have questions about as we're moving through, I encourage you to ask them. Sorry about that. And so our focus is on the connection to the individuals we serve, and our core values are community no matter what. So as an exploited and prostituted person with substance use disorder that was criminalized and super marginalized in my community, one of the things that I never had access to was community. Sure, there were resources in our community and I could go there, right? But was I going to be welcomed? Was I going to be understood? Was I going to be engaged? Or was I going to be treated like a bother and sent on my way? And so that's one of the things that we've worked really hard to do at LIFT. We are a community of unconditional support no matter what. And people can access that community as little and as often as they need to. I always joke with the women at Jana's place that it's like, we never felt like we were part of our own community, so we just built our own. And that's who we are, right? And so people have access to that support regardless of where they are in their process. Another core value is autonomy and choice. We don't believe you can force exiting or recovery on people, right? And we believe that people know what is best for them and how to recover. Transparency and trust. I think a lot of folks have a misunderstanding of what trauma-informed and trauma-sensitive programming is. It's really about transparency, right? And being us being accountable to what we say to them as well. Safety, and then also valuing people as human beings. So if we're going to talk about creating survivor-led framework and what does that mean, we're going to talk about cultivating space for survivor-led and design programming. We involve our participants, so the folks that are seeking our services, in a lot of our program development. Again, for Jana's place right now, we're working on a job development program for them, and having their voice at the table when we're talking about which economic pathways are going to work best for them, right? So instead of us coming in and deciding for folks, making sure that they are at the table and involved in all of those processes. Developing and implementing trauma-informed and resiliency approach training and support for all agency staff. So at LIFT, we have almost 40 employees at this point. All of them are women. This year, at the beginning of the year, we actually shifted to a 32-hour work week, which is now full-time. Without having to reduce salaries, and also began offering health insurance. We believe in order to show up for people, we need to be able to take care of ourselves and our own mental health. And also there's lots of data and research that shows that people live healthier, more productive lives and are more productive at work with a 32-hour work week. And so we've really shifted a primary focus to be able to folks to be able to care for themselves so they can show up as their best selves for the survivors that we support. Again, instituting employee policies that focus on well-being to improve retention and job satisfaction. Oftentimes in substance use programs, in shelters, in all of these different spaces, there's catastrophic burnout happening, right? Like we are working people to the point that they can no longer take care of themselves and their families, and then that trickles down to the participants that we're serving, right? And so really looking at how do we care for ourselves and others. We've implemented quarterly mental health days or reflection days that folks have to take, and it's just a day to check out and check in with yourself and see how you can get yourselves back on track. And then also developing and implementing survivor-centered program data collection and evaluation methods. Oftentimes, we are required to report certain things to our funders. This is like echoing really badly, isn't it? Sorry. Okay. Oftentimes with data evaluation and metrics, we are required to report certain things to our funders, and they ask us to do those things within a certain time frame, and they don't actually think about the impact that has on the folks that we serve. And so, for example, when somebody comes into Jana's place, we're required to do an assessment with them in 72 hours, right? They don't know us at that point, nor do they trust us. And so performing this evaluation to report to the insurance companies is essentially a waste of time, right? Because they're not answering the questions truthfully and honestly. And it's also traumatizing, right? So learning where can we push back and work to change systems that are harming people in the name of collecting data, right? And so we really work hard to ensure that we're not damaging people in the process. Well, I'm going to let Courtney talk about who we serve for a moment, and then.
Did anybody want to jump in on the first part of it? Ooh, questions?
Yeah. Does anybody? Yeah.
Sorry, I promise I will look back to see if there are other questions after I ask my own. It's very selfish. I'm just wondering if you could expand a little bit on what those survivor-centered data collection methods are and how they're different to the ones that the funders have required previously.
Sure. So, like for example, with Jana's Place, we have to do a full biopsychosocial. We have to, because Jana's Place is actually a licensed recovery treatment program, and so just really like informing, like we understand that we have to do an assessment, right? But can we take the assessment that we received from the referring agent, right, until somebody is comfortable enough to meet with us and shift, right? Because and we do this in a lot of our programs. We have our youth programming, Jana's Place, Harbor, and it's like allowing people to like feel safe and supported before we start going through these really invasive questions, and also not asking questions we don't need the answer to. So, a lot of times, and I think it's the GIPRA. Is it the GIPRA? Yes. So there's, I'm not sure. Am I saying that correctly? Yeah. So there's a report that they were requiring folks that were pregnant with substance use disorder to do. And it's like a really lengthy assessment that like takes into account trauma history, all of those things, right? And it's like, you have to complete it the first session you meet with your peer mentor. And it's like, that's pretty terrible. We should not be doing that to people, right? And so figuring out creative ways around having to do those. So for Jana's Place, for example, we'll submit the referral that we received from the insurance company and then wait, right? We also take the time to go through them. So if somebody is saying, we're not just rushing through these assessments to get them done, right? Where if somebody takes 2 or 3 days to answer those questions and we have to keep going back at it, then that's what we'll do. So it's not that we won't get the information that we need, but it's doing it in a way that is sensitive to folks.
Any other questions on part 1 before we move on? I have. Great, okay.
Go ahead.
Hi, I'll introduce myself in a moment, but one of the things that we pushed back on very significantly, in a data collection and a programmatic, checklist was the signs of life. As a treatment facility, we are required to, to make sure that people are safe within our facility, that they're not using, and frankly, that they're going to live through it. I don't really know what the opioid crisis is down in North Carolina, but in Massachusetts, we are one of the states and in Worcester specifically, one of the places in which we have very high levels of fatal overdoses. So, our funders are requiring that we conduct overnight signs of life checks. Up to and including literally coming into the rooms, removing blankets to make sure that people are alive and breathing. Now, I don't know if you've ever rolled up on one of those, like densely saturated trauma survivors in the middle of the night trying to remove a blanket up off them. I can't, I did want, I have never done it. But with someone I was very, very, very comfortable with, I've worked with her for years, I went to pull the blanket down over her feet. She had simply laid down and she jumped up. And was kind of running around the room. When she caught me, she came flying at me to say, Karen, I'm not safe. I had created the lack of safety in that moment for her based off of the trauma. So, we went back and forth with the funder on this, and one of the things that they're sharing is you put that, like we're saying, hey, you can't really, do a good sign of life check, right? without actually inflicting harm or increasing harm. So, they sent us to a bunch of our peers in the community to figure out what they do for the Signs of Life check. And the one that they sent us to where they thought, this is significant, this is appropriate, you should follow that, had suggested that literally, we went to them and said, hi, what are you doing for Signs of Life checks? Because we find them to be a little traumatic and overwhelming for for the women that we're working with, or who live there, frankly. This is their bedroom. This is their home. And I'm walking in, and they suggested what we do is set a flashlight in the middle of the floor in their room, tiptoe up, and pull that blanket back. Make sure they're breathing. And that was the support that we had from our funding agency. We continued to push back to say we will not do these. We could produce research that suggested that Signs of Life checks and routine checks, particularly in spaces where, self-harm at significant levels are, perhaps present, was that in fact instituting that Signs of Life check just gave them the time frame in which they could get away with whatever it is they were trying to do in that moment, which led to greater increased levels of suiciding and fatal overdosing. So if I make my check at 11 o'clock, you got 1 hour before I roll back through. So in that moment, once I've looked at you, you have an hour. Now if you fall off on a bag of bad dope, or good, as the case may be, you're dead before I can get back to you. And as overwhelmed, uncared for, staff in these agencies, particularly through pandemic, that's exactly what we did. We leaned on the data collection rather than the relationship and the individual to help us go through. So, our Signs of Life check, yes, is that we will build relationship. I need to know when you're not okay. My Signs of Life check look like is today a little bit different for you? It was, how are you doing? You didn't show up for dinner, and you always make dinner. You seem a little bit down, or you seem isolated or distant in ways that you are, haven't been yesterday or in the past. Those are my check-ins. Those are my Signs of Life check. If you look like you're nodding out a little bit, let's talk about that. This isn't about setting up systems that don't keep us safe, but keep us controlled and moving toward the spaces that are meaningful for individuals. So that Signs of Life check, we spent the better part of 2 years pushing back on, and we're okay with it. They're okay with it at this point. But this is where, from that survivor-led space, we had the survivors saying, don't do this to us, please. They built this program, and because you chose us to build it, it is now important that you listen to what it is we're saying and acknowledge that. So that was our one small win. We're still working on the others.
I just also wanted to add to that, like when we're talking about creeping in and people sleeping, as a survivor of prostitution and trafficking, sleep was often a tool that was used, like I was deprived sleep, right, and kept up all night. And so to finally be in a space where you're supposed to be safe and working towards healthy sleep habits, and we are essentially assuming the role of the perpetrator, right, and continuing to come in and disrupt that. It was a really important place for us to lean in and say, no, we're not going to do that. And so thankfully, we were able to continue to push that. But oftentimes sleep is a tool that sleep deprivation is a way to control someone, right? And we want to ensure that we're not stepping in and acting as the perpetrator and taking control over people's lives.
Yeah, I also want to say that, or just reiterate that we check in with our participants the same way that we check in with our own friends and family. Like what Karen was saying, we develop relationships with them, so we know so-and-so's not at dinner, there's something wrong. Just like you notice your friend's down or your sister is down, you say, hey, what's going on? I joke sometimes about how we need to have is it People magazine that does stars are just like us. We need people in recovery, they're just like us, So I digress. My name is Courtney Ross Escobar. I'm Chief Operating Officer at LIFT, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the population we serve. So LIFT is an organization that serves individuals that have experienced or are experiencing sexual exploitation, or systems of prostitution. Prostitution is a form of gender-based violence. It is sexual violence and it's physical violence. And this violence is perpetrated by men against women, and trans women are women. We, like Nikki was just talking about, we prioritize the hiring of survivors through all levels of our agency. And we use the term survivors to describe not only people who have exited the life of prostitution, but who remain in the life of prostitution. Because if you are out there experiencing that trauma, violence, and abuse on a daily basis, you are a survivor. We prioritize the hiring of survivors, and we also practice a hiring under versus hiring over, meaning when we are looking to fill leadership roles, we look at our staff and the pathways to success that we have offered and development into our staff so that they are in a position to be elevated to management positions. And I think that our numbers are over 70% of our staff are survivors. Which is incredible. So the realities of the sex trade. Most buyers are white men, affluent, educated, married, with families, which means these are people in your communities. They're your doctors, they're your lawyers, they're your neighbors, they're your family members. They are not sexual predators that are transported from another planet into your community. You're interacting with these people on a daily basis. The average prostituted person is Black and brown women and girls, and members of the LGBTQIA communities. It is shocking. A study conducted in 2019 in the US found that 15% of men in the US have paid for sex, and more than 20% of men who had never paid for sex reported they would consider doing so if circumstances were right. I don't know what the right circumstances are, but I want to be very clear. It's not the purchasing of sex. It's the purchasing of access to a vulnerable person's body to abuse and then pay them so you don't get arrested. This is non-consensual interactions. This is not two consenting adults, because if money is having to be exchanged for access to somebody's body, and if there was no money, there would be no access, this is coercion, this is rape. Men and boys are socially conditioned to believe that women and girls are commodities, that you can purchase their bodies to use and abuse as you would like. And that is what we talk about when we talk about toxic masculinity and oppression of women and the role that the patriarchy plays. I think it's important to point out that that the equality model, which is the solution to eliminating the sex trade that Nikki also touched upon, used to be called the Nordic model. It's now the equality model. It's been implemented in 10 countries, and it originated in Sweden. And Sweden issued a report in 2019 about the effects that the Nordic or equality model had on society, and after 20 years of implementation. And it was really interesting and refreshing to see that after the implementation of the equality model, which will decriminalize people being exploited, but increase criminal penalties on exploiters and buyers, that there's other elements as well, but that the social attitude among men and boys on purchasing sex had shifted. That before the equality model was implemented in Sweden, it was thought to be acceptable and even a trait of masculinity that you are purchasing sex. And we see that in our culture too, like with strip clubs and rap videos and things. But after 20 years of the implementation of the equality model, the younger generation of men and boys had a very different opinion on purchasing women's bodies for sex. It was viewed as extremely negative. So there is, when you shift laws and legislation, there is a direct impact on the societal response and morals, right? Who we serve. So we serve mostly women, although men and boys are also impacted by the sex trade, but women are overwhelmingly the victims of systems of prostitution. And the individuals we serve are living at multiple intersections of multiple vulnerabilities, right? Like prostitution does not just happen in a vacuum. You don't have a full life and go out and be part of a system of prostitution, right? You're usually experiencing homelessness, you're experiencing substance use disorder, you're experiencing mental health disorders. These chronic illnesses are not being medically treated. You're experiencing violence by the hands of someone you may consider as your boyfriend, but is your exploiter, your pimp. You're experiencing violence from people purchasing access to your body. You don't have food. There's a lot of things happening. You're not just being prostituted. And I think it's important to understand that prostitution is a result of systemic failures in our society, and it's also rooted in racism, misogyny, and the patriarchy. So there's a lot of work to do. I don't know how we tackle equality for women and girls and BIPOC populations and LGBTQ communities if we are allowing the selling and purchasing of women and girls' bodies for the purpose of violence.
Hey, everybody. Sorry about that. I was up here talking earlier. I'm Karen Riley McNary. I'm VP of Outreach and Advocacy for Living in Freedom Together, which is kind of a weird title. I do the programming. Programic models. Courtney's just talking about the vulnerabilities of individuals, and that leads to the importance of how we do our work. We were talking about trauma survivors. Basic definition of that is there was nothing you or anybody else could do to change your situation. So the important piece post-trauma, along with everything that was talked about earlier this morning, is that we give that power back, and the way to give that power back is to start looking to the people and see what they need. So let's talk a little bit about our program model of who we are and what we do. Jana's Place is a 16-bed co-occurring enhanced treatment facility for substance use disorder, where we just use a trauma recovery, resiliency-based, model. So let me back up just a little bit. I've been doing this work for greater than 30 years. I am one of the professional allies that was brought in to create this programming, that knew my way around grants and regulations and the rest of it to get to the place we needed to be, which was the voice of the survivor in that space. So it is a one-of-a-kind residential program. It is one of the first in the United States, certainly in the Commonwealth of New England. The that is designed where survivors essentially take responsibility for their own recovery based off of a series of, of tools and relationships tools we use and relationships that we, develop to help people not recreate life, but to gain access to it in ways that, that weren't. Again, remembering that, the multiple intersectionalities create a space in which there are multiple vulnerabilities, and that those folks know where they're going, despite that, kind of robust, chaotic combo. They know where they're going, they know what they're about, they know what they're looking for. It is our job to help gain access to it, correct? So this is medical care model. It's easy, I apologize, you guys. If you don't mind, I'm gonna work off the big screen here, which I can see better without my glasses. So we work on individualized schedules. So every week, like the women that are living there are creating their own schedules to get back their lives, to gain back to the place and places, their autonomy, to work within the world and travel through their, every day in a way that is meaningful for them. So our individualized schedules are there to address issues of medical care, mental health, employment, volunteering, all of those things that didn't happen while the life and the rest of this was going on, right? So we do that through this piece of recreation. Our survivors have said, hey, we need to do more of actually living. We do not want 30 meetings in 30 days. We don't want to be out of here with 3 months with a basic set of coping mechanisms that do not build us life, with our get well job that takes us nowhere in a housing market that we can't afford. So essentially, we're offering people the idea, if you just come in here and sit in my program, you too can gain sobriety and that will change your world. But we've never asked them what their world looks like or what they want it to look like in that space. So that big recreation piece, is the one that we take most seriously. There are some ways that we do the actual work for people to understand and maintain their gains on their world. My guess is, raise of hands, any kind of self-sufficiency matrix, Arizona, Snohomish County, your own, or anything else, are we familiar with this? Show of hands. Is this new to people? Yes. It is new to people. So these are really just, like person-centered, case management-based space. I love the self-sufficiency matrix. It doesn't allow us to lie to ourselves. It doesn't allow us to live under anybody else's assessment of us. We choose where we're going, and we let ourselves know. So go ahead with the Arizona self-sufficiency matrix, Snohomish County, Washington State. These are really big places where they are using an individualized, assessment of where we stand today. But rather than where we stand today and let me, just make this assessment and move on, this builds everything that we're doing, okay? So this is, where do you want to be in life? Where do you feel like you should be? So, I'm not going to go through this all because it is a really, it's a popular tool. It is comprehensive. It does, when we sit down to do finances, budgeting, things like that, it is all encompassing, and as in everything ties to it. We can't just say, I need to be able to pay my phone, my cigarettes, my apartment, and I'm great. What about your kids? What about your education? What about childcare? What about, family unification programming? What about all of these things? Court fees and the rest. So the self-sufficiency matrix allows us to look at whole life living, okay? To the best of our, to where we wish to go rather than what anybody else associates for us. From that, and I should say within this, the second piece of that we use in our programming is the eco-mapping space or the social networking. So how do each one of these domains within this piece, how are they resourced in their personal network and in the community network? Again, we are building access based off what that individual person needs, correct? How do we know what the individual person needs? Is that we come from and are part of. They inform us at all stages. Coming from the life and being in these places where we've spiraled up within ourselves is we also know that we can trust that because we are that. That is us. That is who we are. Everybody in this room has the capacity to, change your future, do what you want to do today. Did everybody get up this morning and roll through your morning like you wanted to? No. Okay, we'll stop it. Most of us got up and did what we wanted to first. Yes, we did. Okay? There we are. So what we're building is a programming in which, we do that first. And we focus on joy. We focus on joy in the deepest, darkest spaces that they are at. I'm not talking about the toxic positivity. I'm talking about rebuilding. One of the things that came up this morning was forest bathing. During pandemic and the isolation, we needed to be able to keep people moving forward to maintain hope, correct? In a sense of extreme isolation, which didn't look a lot different from the isolation that most people came with. So we had to stop and be incredibly mindful during my morning started with, how are you landing on this world today? What are you saving space for yourself and others? And at noon, we got the heck out so that we could burn off a little bit of what was percolating inside. So, whether you want to call it a, just a run out or a forest bathing practice, that's exactly what we did to stay mindful to our process and the joy that we were working with. We take vacations. I mean who here has taken a vacation recently? Yes. Hello, everybody else. Should you look at that? I don't know. I might have if it were me, Also, haven't taken a vacation recently, so let me not get too uppity up here, in this space. But that's exactly what we're talking about. We vacation. We talk about birthday parties, with children. We look at what they're doing beyond in this, we focus on safe. Well, this is up here. We are safe. We go to movies. We are consistent with our expectation that you will build a life that you believe is worth living. And, to that DBT piece this morning, it's the best life worth living in and outside of your symptoms. So we think trauma and, and substance use disorder. We think that substance use disorder is kind of a symptom of trauma. It's a cover. It's a coping mechanism that is no longer working for us. So how do we build the coping mechanisms that will work for us, that will be meaningful for us? And the only way to do that is to actually ask that individual, much like I would my own kid, or my partner, or myself. I think Julia's going to take us through. Oh,
So I just wanted to add, with the access to joy and the vacation. So when you're in prostitution, I lived the life of prostitution for 20 years. I didn't know what I liked, what brought me joy, right? I liked whatever you liked or whoever was paying to access my body liked, right? You have to morph and change in order to earn that money, right? You become what everybody else wants you to. And so I didn't get to experience things like vacation or joy and so oftentimes when you're stepping out of the life or have lived a lifetime full of violence, right? Part of recovery is figuring out who you are, right? And what you like to do. And so part of the programming at Jana's Place is just that, right? I mean, when I first got out, I tried rowing. Turns out I hate it, right? Not a rower. But I tried it, right? And it's like encouraging people. We take a retreat to North Carolina every year. We come down, we load up our 16-passenger van and take a road trip and rent a house on the beach, right? And I will tell you, sometimes you get down there and it's like, I'm just going to stay in my room and watch Netflix. It's like, nope, no, you're not. You're going to come out to the beach, right? And you're going to try it. And if at the end of the week you decide you hate the beach, you hate the beach, right? But at least we are giving access to things that everybody else does. I went through so many recovery programs, and that they have this saying, it's like, have an attitude of gratitude and everything will change, right? And it's like, pardon me, but F off, right? Like, you're taking my food stamps, I have nothing to eat, you're making me go to these awful meetings that aren't working for me, that don't address my trauma, right? Gratitude is not going to fix that, right? And also, we should be forcing that on people, right? And so really, allowing people to feel the way they feel. I mean, there was a woman in one of our programs, and, at one point, she'd been there for a while, and at one point she was complaining about the wattage on the light bulbs we used, right? And everybody was like, God, I can't take this anymore. But it's like, she finally feels safe enough to tell us what she likes and what she doesn't like, right? We're not changing the light bulbs, Roberta, but, it's fine. You know what I mean? But people finally being in a space where they can actually share what they don't like and what they like, right? and recognizing that like we build programs and provide the bare minimum for people and then tell them that they need to be grateful for that. That is not true. People don't have to be grateful that their life ended them in a residential treatment program with very little support in the community or anywhere else, right? And so just remind, like, it's okay that they're not grateful, right? That's not going to shift everything. How we shift is by helping people build a life worth living, where they feel like they have purpose, where they feel like they have meaning, where they have access to joy and all of the things that they need in life.
And I think it's that gratitude that, you know, you are grateful for me. Like I'm doing the work. I'm getting paid to come in and do a pretty cool thing with some pretty cool people. So, so there's that. But one of the things that we use in terms of measuring that progress, there's a lot of things that we use in measuring, you know, progress for people. First of all, that self-sufficiency matrix walks out the door with you. You can measure your own damn progress. That eco map goes with you because you can look and say, oof, I don't have a really good connection to family unification programming. This is why I'm struggling to regain relationship with, you know, my people. You know, these are things that folks are learning. So it's not just, you know, accepting or, you know, recognizing that their voice is important, but give it all back. You know, give it all back in tools and actions. Walk with them through everyday life rather than, you know, force them out there. But one of the things that I want to say is most important about the work that we do is we are always spiraling up regardless of setback. In the recovery community, and I come from the trauma world, so the recovery community is a little bit newer to me. I find it stunning that if you have a short relapse or any kind of short, long, ugly, small, or whatever it may be, that we consider this something that is a complete and utter setback. You have failed, actually, and you're starting again. I have kind of fucked up a few things over the years, and I've never had to restart my life. You know, I have never been deemed incompetent. I've never been deemed, you know, like unable. And by listening to folks as they are struggling to gain the place that they're going, do you know what I have found most about the issue of relapse? Is that they had not learned enough about themselves. Nikki's speaking on that imposter syndrome. They had not learned enough about themselves or felt worthy enough to be able to use the skills that they have used to get them through the more challenging moments. And I can't think of a better opportunity to jump in and say, no, you got this. What are we learning? Where are we growing from on this? How are, you know, like, and I don't do that by sitting in an office. I'm like, girl, get up, let's go. Let's get some, you know, like we're going for ice cream. I got to do my grocery shopping. You know, you need to get out. Do we need to just have this conversation? You know, these are my, like, we can be friends and still have boundaries, y'all. We can listen to what folks are saying and agree that even if it is the most outrageous thing ever, that's their step to their best life, worth living, in and outside of symptoms. And I'll tell you what, I have been down some pretty crazy lanes with some shit I've never been able to do in my entire, you know, 30 plus some odd year of careers. And it has been so wildly successful. Just the notion of competence. So I think Julia is going to, you know, take us through what really is the academic portion of what we're doing. We're just out there doing it. Thank God for Julia, who helps us understand what it is we're doing.
I don't know about that. Please. I'm Julia Reddy, and I attest to none of the expertise that Karen just endowed me with. But so I got to know Lyft as that lanyard-strapped bureaucrat doing site visits at treatment programs all over Massachusetts. I work for the State Department of Public Health, and I noticed immediately that what Lyft was doing was different. It felt different, it sounded different, it looked different, and so then I left my job and came back to graduate school to a large degree because I saw this disconnect between a lot of the research and literature and then a lot of like what seemed to be working in the community. So a huge just kind of point of gratitude that I've had is this continued relationship with Lyft and this ability to see how we can kind of amplify the lessons that they're learning and the things that they're doing, and potentially enlarge the scientific literature with that. So some of the stuff that I have learned from them and that I think is really important to kind of reiterate is there's this element of purpose, there's this element of activism, there's this element of kind of drive that seems to be really important in one's individual recovery, and then also in kind of bridging that disconnect between the knowledge that survivors have and the knowledge that bureaucrats and academics really need. Also, I think that survivor-led and survivor-managed programming offers a sense of empathy and identification that is just very, very difficult to bridge, even with tremendous stockpiles of CEUs. I think that a lot of what I see in programming is this kind of, okay, we'll just, get you a couple months sober and send you on your way, and you should be able to succeed in the world. And what I hear from LIFT is this realistic sense that the world out there is not easy to navigate. It's not built for people who don't have, intergenerational wealth and resources and tons of institutional and informal support. So there's a sense of like realism in their aftercare planning, and there's also this open door, like Nikki was saying, they've built a community, they've built a place of belonging. So if you get launched and you realize, your job at Dunkin' Donuts isn't exactly building you this kind of two-car garage life that you envision for yourself, there is always this home base, there is always this open community where there are job opportunities, there are ways to engage and maintain relationships. And then also the last one, I think, is that there's something beyond not using stigmatizing language. There's something beyond going away from hooker and abuser. There's something in the embodiment of survivors that shows kind of a transgression beyond a transcendence, beyond a derogatory label, beyond the identity of someone who is problematic or marginalized in our society, right? So there's something really powerful for me to stand up here and say, I'm an alcoholic and drug addict in long-term recovery. It's not only the fact that I'm not calling it drug abuser or junkie. It's the fact that I'm standing here with a lanyard on, talking in front of a microphone, having had that lived experience, right? So I think that there's something really powerful about survivor-led programming in terms of the embodiment of transcendence. So what do we do with the research and academic literature that we have? I've done some, now I know that there's like brilliant people in this audience, and the presentations just this week, I think, have a lot to teach us. I've done some kind of cursory searches of the literature, and a lot of the evaluations that I see, both for exiting prostitution and also recovery from substance use disorder, measure outcomes like this. They measure abstinence time, they measure retention and treatment and service programs, they measure recidivism and relapse, whether it's the criminal legal system, prostitution reentry, substance use, recurrence. They measure months housed in housing, they measure employment, they measure program completion. And I just want to ask you guys, is 1 month abstinent from, let's say, drugs and alcohol or prostitution the same? If it is coerced, if it is achieved in an incarcerated setting, if it is, under threat of, random urinalysis or reincarceration, is that the same month of abstinence than something that is fought for and willingly engaged? I think there's room for debate here, whether kind of a little bit of separation from intoxication or prostitution is worthwhile, however it's achieved. But I just want to think more closely about the qualitative nature, about the kind of experience of recovery. So a lot of times survivors of prostitution and people in substance use recovery are reduced to data points. Program completers, recidivisers, compliant with medication, days off the track, days in shelter. Survivors are often not viewed as full human beings with wants and hopes and dreams and experiencing kind of the full spectrum of human emotion. And I want to just kind of throw out this a little bit controversial comment that bodies who are purchased for access and data points and fatal overdoses and clients and patients all have this anonymized, dehumanizing nature to that label, to that reduction to a number, to a statistic. We're failing to see kind of the 3D body of the human in front of us and taking time to learn who they are, what they like, and genuinely kind of caring about their quality of life. So what I'm suggesting after kind of hearing what Lyft is doing and being incredibly impressed with the way that they sort of organically but also very intentionally have created this comprehensive and qualitative approach to building recovery, I want to offer some ways in which the academic literature could begin to build a body around measuring and validating and quantifying some of those outcomes. So these are some suggestions that we've seen kind of emerge in their programming and in their work and in their priorities and the priorities of their participants. Quality of life, how do we measure that? Autonomy, self-efficacy, the motivation to kind of stay engaged and show up. Feelings of purpose and self-worth, senses of trust, formation of friendships, feeling of belonging in a group or community, mental and physical well-being, we have tons of measurements for that, positive self-regard. So thinking about not only kind of quantifying and building measurements around some of these factors, but also applying them to substance use recovery and prostitution exiting program evaluations. I was doing some kind of connection to existing research. So I know Shelley Greenfield and her colleagues, including Dawn Sugarman, they've studied gender-specific addiction treatment for a long time. They have a lot of really important research. They did a 2-site RCT of her gender-specific treatment group. And what they found as the causal mechanism that differentiated kind of the mixed gender generic psychoed group from this, manualized evidence-based intervention was the number of affiliative statements that were passing between the women. So in the women's only group, they were saying nice things to each other, and that seemed to help. So we're seeing these things about belonging and forming relationships showing up even in very kind of rigorous RCT studies. John Kelly has done incredible work studying sustained recovery. A lot of addiction research focuses on moments of crisis and overdose and problematic use. He studies people who have resolved or he did a huge kind of nationally representative sample of people who say they've resolved a substance use issue. And he has found gender differences in quality of life measures. He's also found a kind of decline of senses of well-being and positive feelings in the first year of recovery and then slow increases over the next 5 years. So we are kind of seeing some attempt at measuring well-being and feelings of happiness in the substance use literature. And then Hedden and Manson had a small qualitative study in Sweden among women who had exited prostitution and found that what they described as being helpful for their exiting was supportive relationships, the ability to mobilize informal and professional support services, and their capacity to kind of change their coping strategies. So we are seeing some emergent literature. We're seeing I found a lot of kind of conceptual models around sort of the stages of exiting of prostitution and re-engaging and then exiting again. And even just this year, an article came out that was it was an evaluation of a prostitution court program, which, whatever. How effective that is, but even they said like program completion and reoffending outcomes were myopic and insufficient, and they wanted to add some more, but we're still not seeing enough in the literature around measuring these kind of holistic and comprehensive understandings of recovery. So I just have a recommendation. This article came out in 2010, and it kind of defined 4 categories of barriers to prostitution exiting. So individual, relational, structural, societal. Individual substance use, mental health disorders, trauma, shame, physical health, then formal and informal supports, relationships, structural level, employment, basic needs, criminal records, those kind of logistical barriers, and then societal, meaning discrimination and stigma. So one suggestion is to take that list of factors that we think from Jana's place and from this emerging work are really important to kind of focus on in measuring recovery and kind of mapping them onto these 4 levels of what they called barriers. So it is a little bit like our keynote. There's a nice resonance between the opening speaker and this in terms of sort of flipping the script and looking at the resilience. What does that look like when we're addressing those barriers on those 4 levels? So mapping quality of life and this feeling of autonomy onto the individual level barriers, motivation, friendship, belonging. And then for the structural barriers, I mean, I'm from state government, like we're all aware of budgets and limited, resources in the community and providers and the limitations of those, but kind of this self-motivated drive towards seeking resources and accessing supports, a self-directed utilization of services. And then societally, I mean, discrimination and shame, right? These are kind of these amorphic overarching concepts, but how do we see that progress in an individual's recovery? It would be trying to measure senses of purpose, feelings of self-worth, and internalized positive regard. These are things that I have not seen applied to the substance use and prostitution exiting literature. I'm no expert, I'm brand new kind of at this, but these are things that I think we as a group and with people's support and help would like to kind of distill down how to measure those effectively, and how to measure those in this population to build out program evaluation literature that we think is actually measuring the aspects of recovery that are important to the people who have recovered or who are recovering or who have experienced prostitution, as opposed to, the kind of easy to measure or the things that the academics have come up with already. So we want to move to discussion. We have the experts up here, so if you guys have questions about anything that we talked about, and then also I think we're really curious in kind of some ideas for how to move this forward. So this is sort of a new, it's not new for them, but it's this kind of emerging project that we want to work on where we start to sort of codify some of those factors, and I think you guys all have diverse expertise, so we'd be very interested to hear your reflections on how those might be measured. And I have my pen. If anybody has citations that I missed, I would really appreciate that. And then also reflecting on your own work. How are you guys engaging with and collaborating with survivors? How are they leading your work? How could they lead your work? And how could some of these ideas filter into your programming focus? And then how might you measure and start to incorporate into your evaluation some of these kind of comprehensive, holistic ideas of recovery? So thank you guys so much for your time, and we'll open it for questions.
Really, really wonderful symposium. Thank you all so much. So I'm going to sort of wander around and sort of pass the mic to others if they have questions or want to address any of the discussion questions that they posted.
Hello. Hey. I have a question on just getting a little bit of, it sounds like there's probably some mandatory reporters, whether by medical care or psychiatric care, kind of involved in your organization. And as a nurse practitioner, just curious about how to navigate, with a trauma-informed and that trust relationship with a patient, mandatory reporting, and how you guys navigate that, and if you have any advice or insight for practitioners in assessing for violence and trauma and all that stuff, but recognizing that that's a really difficult position to put a patient in.
So we are mandatory reporters, so we are required by law to report if, there's a potential for abuse and neglect, but, you know, how we try to do that is actually with the survivor. And so, you know, we never want to blindside anybody. We have had to report, you know, but really sitting down and explaining why we have to report, and then also writing down a plan, like with their strengths, leading with their strengths, right? So we're not, would you agree?
I do agree.
So that's how we typically do it. Like, we do it together. Like, we're going to call them together. Let's put a plan together with all of your strengths. Where do you have really strong supports? Where do you, right? So that you're not, we never blindside anybody. We're always like just 100% upfront with them. So that would be my suggestion.
Being that, you know, we do show up a little bit differently, you know, in that space of togetherness with folks, we definitely have a different kind of relationship. But if we flip back to that self-sufficiency matrix, right, and trying to attach things to the space in which we can grow, where it's meaningful to them, isn't that what it is? I have to report this, but I'm going to tear your life up doing it one way. However, if we can sit down and look at the real barriers that you face with compassion, humane, understanding that you are competent and with capacity in that moment, and the things that are happening are, you know, are things that you can impact, but may not have been able to back in the day. So I go back to that self-sufficiency matrix. You want family unification? You're trying to talk, you know, how are we working with your kids? What is Nikki's talking about that eco map. You know, who is helping you support with those children? If we're talking about children, if we're talking about elder, you know, and I will just use children at this point, you know, within that space. So how are we using that self-sufficiency matrix to really look at where you're at and what kinds of steps you are going to be taking, that plan, that outline, that treatment plan, to your best life worth living, in and outside of your symptoms. And part of that is actually, again, being present with them. Before I came here, we flew in yesterday evening, bought a couple of food trucks. I am not a, you know, like, this is not my role. But I bought a couple of food trucks because I had been asked to over a period of, you know, looking at next steps in employment with people and access to it. So, you know, I've got these food trucks, right, and a plan to be able to support those, whether you want to, you know, learn to cook and sell pinchos outside of the bodega, or whether or not you want to bring that all the way up to your MBA out of Clark University. And if you want to know what that looks like in scope or time for someone that is coming off the street today, go ahead and ask me about that. But I got your pathway for you, depends on where you want to go, you know, within that. So that is actually how we handle those points too. You know, and I've built the relationship to do it. And in the medical community, as a nurse practitioner, are you really going to be able to do that? I think I'm actually selling you a unicorn. Right. We talked about earlier. This is no squirrel. You know, but in that space, you know me, don't you? And guess what? For greater than 30 years, I was, well, no, not quite, because no, I'm not like that. I'm talking about my today. So back in the day when I met Nikki, I too was that professional that didn't have a bridge. This is why you bring your peers. I gain access because people who understand and know what this process looks like can come to me. And then I do it with a place that's worth doing. Nobody wants to stock shelves overnight at Price Right their whole lives. Nobody wants to sling Dunkin' Donuts. So I do have your path. You want an MBA? This is one of the ways I can get you there, but you have to work with the people who are actually in that lived experience. I cannot stress that enough. I started in CSEC work back in 1989. Until I met Nikki, I don't know, closing on a decade now. And you know, and just in that moment, that was my aha professional moment, in which I had someone that was willing to do it right, to go to the places that needed to happen, to be able to get a group of invisible, unprotected, very vulnerable individuals to our, you know, to our door, and have some successes. Again, we talk about that 70%. I think we started with Nikki. Most of those folks have come from in-house, with a few people moving to come and do the work that we're doing as survivors. So, you know, from out of the area. But most of that came from in-house development and the respect that they know what they're doing. They know their own well-being. So bring your survivors in. I don't know where you're from, but we may have a connection for you. So if you want to, jump up and find out who's in your neighborhood, let us know. And get our number in case there's nobody there.
Other questions? Thank you.
Hi. As a provider who is trying to get my patients to specific resources, how do you find that most of your survivors come to Jana's House? Is it mainly word of mouth? Is there a referral process?
So there is a referral process for Jana's Place, but most of our referrals are actually through word of mouth, which I really also think speaks volumes about the work that we're doing, right? That they're out there encouraging their friends to come see us, I think is important. But for Jana's Place specifically, there is a referral process. Most of their referrals come from either detox facilities or inpatient psychiatric hospitals or spaces like that. But folks self-refer. They can come over to Harbor and walk in, essentially. But for Jana's Place very specifically, there's a referral. But most referrals for LIFT are either self-referred or from word of mouth, from supporting each other.
They bring them through our Harbor program, which is the low barrier shelter. That's where people show up from. We are actually funded by our city, which is a little disappointed when we take people from not our city, and want to push back on that. But that's a lot of it. We have people coming from everywhere to that intervention point to be able to, get into the network that will trust and, and receive. So.
And Harbor, essentially, it's like I had mentioned, it's a low barrier, maximum vulnerability shelter, but also it's a day resource center, right? So folks can walk in and there are survivor case managers there to help them navigate resources and get them connected to the things that they need.
But from a national perspective, because you're not in Massachusetts and that's the only program of its type, you can ask survivors in your network where they go, what they trust. I mean, the best Google review for the good program is going to be that the one that the women want to go back to after they've had a slip, right?
Yep.
So that's one idea, is to kind of you tap into the word of mouth in this community and make sure you're sending people to programs that have a good rep.
Yeah. And also vet programs, I always say that because for us, we've had to vet providers, right? Because if we send one of our women over to somebody and they are treated like garbage, which happens frequently. I also want to recognize that when I had untreated mental health and substance use and was super reactive, I needed somebody to show unconditional positive regard for me and not be you have an attitude, get out of here, right? But when we send our women over somewhere and they are not treated well, that then damages the trust that they have in us, right? Because we suggested they go see this person. So I would also suggest vetting people in your community and seeing what that is like when people show up. And I know that's an extra step and it's a lot of work, but if we want people to actually get the services and support and that it's worth our time to do that, right?
And it's worth thinking about what a warm handoff is, because it's not a phone number on a piece of paper. It's not an address with a Google Map link. It's a red building, it's on there, it's safe to walk there, there's a if we're thinking about the actual process of attempting to engage with a new service, that's already scary. So making that really easy. I don't think it's too much work to vet a service.
No.
It's important, and it's important to know how to get there when they're open and which name to use when you walk in to make sure they have someone to talk to.
And to go with them.
There we go. Can you get out, we need to get out of our offices. We walk in life with people who are learning to live it again and to make their choices. I cannot emphasize enough the imposter, syndrome that Nikki is, was talking about. If you were bouncing in and out of cars every 15, 30 minutes, if you're going in and out of hotel rooms, if you were being paid to be a particular, personality, scene, look, whatever it is, it's not too very long before you lose who you are entirely. And let's be real, you didn't get there without something happening first. Most of us do not pick up on this. I don't care what the sex worker population tells us that this looks like. It's just not. For the majority of, of people impacted by the sex trade, they are, they need us to go with them, please. We wear We as communities put that neon scarlet letter on, and then, do not help them, help to remove it. We are judgy as anything. We need to be able to go with people for as long as it takes for them to get there themselves. If you are a new practitioner to my individual, I have vetted you and I am there with you. Sometimes I have to tell you what you need to know for that individual, just up front. And sometimes I need to say, whoa, stop. Like, what's happening here? Is this necessary, kind of thing, as people learn to go, with themselves. And by walking with, not in front of or behind, actually, I have found, has people picking it up really, really, really quickly. It is permission to live and to be part of their life and their own world is what we're gaining back. And again, I think we've simplified this somewhat. We have a holistic, we have an enclosed circle of support services, because one of the measurements that I look at is when there is a relapse or a bounce off or a trip up in their goal plan, is how quickly they come on back. And that, to me, is the measure for the very, very vulnerable.
And like Karen talked about, we have this like enclosed circle. So this year we're launching our outpatient mental health clinic, and our goal is to hopefully increase capacity to treat trauma in our community. So we're hiring our own mental health clinician. We also are launching our legal clinic this year because, again, like a criminal record becomes a huge barrier to accessing employment, housing, all of those things, right? And we don't have folks in our community that are doing that, so we're gonna do it. And so, like we talked about this like closed loop, we've really built kind of this community and resource network within LIFT that address all of those kinds of barriers that we've talked about. And so, yeah, just wanted to add that.
I think we have time for one more question, if anybody has one. Sure.
Regarding like the legal changes or maybe other like broader community or society level changes you were talking about, like with the Nordic equality model, if you all didn't have resource constraints, what kind of systemic changes would you like to see in your community?
So, so this year we did file legislation. It was an act to strengthen justice and support for survivors of the sex trade. We are refiling in January, and that bill, essentially what it will do is decriminalize for the exploited person, continue fines and penalties for buyers and traffickers, and also create this interagency committee, essentially, that will look at on-ramps into prostitution and create actual pathways out and off-ramps. I think, when we talk about if we didn't have resource constraints, right, I would talk about prevention, right? We always do a lot of, we do reactive work, right? It's like, pulling the bodies out of the river rather than like going upstream and figuring out, okay, how do we prevent this, right? And that's through education for young men and boys, right? We do a lot of talking about, how to teach young women not to be victimized, right? Rather than teaching young men not to perpetrate. And so for me, I would pour a bunch of money into prevention money and change change legislation so we can begin to kind of like shift culturally how we view women and girls, Yeah, go.
And I can add to that, actually.
Sure, go ahead.
Because what we're launching when we return, not just food trucks, but the other piece that we're launching is we recognize that we are not an island in our community, actually. We have a lot of really wonderful, organizations and agencies who are completely powerless as it pans out. So part of those Nikki was just talking about those on-ramps at a legislative level, that we can, legislate prevention training. We can legislate, closing some of those on-ramps, but there are other vulnerabilities. We're talking about the intersectionality of identities. We have people doing amazing work in, in oppression-based spaces around our community, but again, powerless. So coming together with those, really strong and moving, agencies and partners who are moving agendas forward so that we can ultimately, close some of those. We talk about a pipeline to prison. We talk about a pipeline to poverty. We do not talk about a pipeline to prostitution. in these spaces. So, within this is coming together with those agencies to be able to influence the massive dollars that actually do come into our communities, because they do. In Worcester alone, I think we're 800 million nonprofit philanthropic, money from others, philanthropic, monies, and how do we come together to influence the work that those of us that are doing to truly build equity within our communities so that we reduce vulnerabilities, to provide protections from massive institutions that are not protecting where they should, in those trauma spaces. We are going to intervene in the ACEs because we need less of those to be less of this. And, and that's ultimately where it is. So we have a group of folks in our community that we're coming together with to actually co-share some of our, small amounts of power to influence bigger spaces, and to sort of collectively push some of this forward so that along with these, socialization and, legislative spaces, that we are also supporting each other's work when it influences each other's work, and that's the other piece that we're going to do. And we're going to do it with food trucks.
Yeah, you are. All right. Thank you, everybody, for your questions. Thank you so much to the panel. It was really wonderful. Thank you so much. So now I think we have our break for the next 14 minutes. The rolls right into lunch. But anybody who's waiting for outside's now welcome to come on in.
Can someone take our photo by chance?